Here we go. Recording. Good. Yes, so we're recording this so all of our members and Patreons, or patrons, I suppose, can get access to this in the future. Thank you all for coming, being a part of our community, and supporting, I think, just good art, good media right now, and also House of Pod. Whether you're a member, patron, or you just found this event and decided to join us. We are a production company in Denver. We also have an incubator for women of color, and we are also working with our community to reopen a community recording studio and have some equipment available for folks who are creating their own podcasts right now from home, which is a little different from what we had planned originally, but we were rolling with it, and we have some amazing teachers like Mia, and then William, who's on this call, is doing an event later this month, and so lots of ways to stay connected to one another and continue to create beautiful podcasts. So I'm going to introduce Mia. I'm a big fan. Mia actually came and spent a month with us in January. Gosh, that was 2020. That feels like so long ago.
Thought everything was chill back then.
Yeah, it was a different life. It was a different life. And Mia's currently in Brooklyn, and she's the executive producer of Feeling My Flo, which is an amazing podcast all about tweens and their menstruation experiences, stories, really good stuff. I'm a big fan. And she's also a 2020 editing fellow for Feet in Two Worlds. She's also worked for StoryCorps and was a reporter at Marfa Public Radio in West Texas. And we just have had a blast learning with Mia in the past, and I'm really excited that she's willing to do this course. So thanks for tuning in. I think we all know Zoom protocol at this point. So if you have any questions, feel free to raise a hand or set something in the chat. I know Mia's got about 30 minutes of teaching, and then we'll launch into some Q&A and have time to just explore the questions that you might have and ideas you all might have, especially for pandemic interviewing. So I'll hand it over to you, Mia. Take it away.
Thanks, Becca. I know we're all Zoom experts now, but this is the first time that I'm doing a Zoom training, so bear with me. But I'm really excited that people are still hopping on Zoom calls at this point. It keeps me hopeful about the future of all of our Zoom meetings. So, hey everyone, my name is Mia, and as Becca said, I produce a podcast called Feeling My Flo that actually just launched on a new tweens podcast network last week. Yay. So if you have any tweens in your life that might need a podcast about menstruation in their lives, or if you just want to check it out, you can totally do that, and I can send you a link later. I also, as Becca mentioned, work for Feet in Two Worlds, which is a kind of small, scrappy nonprofit that is a training program. So what we do is we train immigrant journalists and journalists of color in radio reporting techniques, and then we help try to get their stories on national news outlets like, NPR and WNYC and stuff like that. So I've done a lot of radio training. And before all of that, actually for 4.5 years, I was at StoryCorps. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about StoryCorps in this presentation, just because that was excellent training and learning how to interview people. I'm going to share my screen with you now. Let's see how this goes. All right, can everybody see that? All right, cool. Okay, so this is just a little bit about my my journey. So I actually didn't get into radio until I had graduated from college, and I was in Peru for a year on a Fulbright fellowship, and I was looking into the Japanese Peruvian community and ended up producing my very first radio story. So I was doing oral history interviews, and I actually took one of those interviews and produced a story for Latino USA. It was a great experience. Latino USA is a wonderful program, and they work a lot with young producers that have no experience like me. So that's kind of how I got started. After that, I moved on to Marfa Public Radio, and that's where I got a lot of great field reporting experience. I got to host a music show called No Country for Old Music, and got to like do everything. Like, it's a really small station in the middle of West Texas. There's only 6 people that work at the station. So by the time I left, they like let me host morning edition, which I think is really hilarious. But great training ground for just learning how to put a radio piece together. And then, like I said, I was at StoryCorps for a few years and did a lot of recording interviews in all kinds of weird locations, some of which were much better for recording than others, and kind of interviewing people from all walks of life. And then what I'm working on now, which is my menstruation podcast, Feeling My Flo. I also was the lead producer on Sunstorm, which is an interview show with Alicia Garza and Ai-jen Poo, and I'm the editing fellow for Feeding Two Worlds. So we're going to talk about a little bit about pre-interviewing and prepping for the interview. We're going to talk about asking questions during the interview, thinking like an editor in the interview, and then I added a fun slide at the end so we could talk a little bit about tech adjustments during the pandemic. And I would not say that I'm an expert on it, but the past month and a half, I've literally been doing all of my recordings remotely, and I've had to change everything about the way that I produce podcasts. So I hope that I can at least talk about what's working for me right now. Okay, so pre-interviewing. For me, a pre-interview is really like an audition. So there's kind of 3 things that I'm thinking about when I'm calling somebody to pre-interview them. I'm testing the waters to see if they're a good talker. I'm drawing out details to get more of a sense of what the story is, and I'm building a relationship and rapport with them. So, you know, it kind of depends on your bandwidth. Like, if you have a lot of time to pre-interview people, it can be kind of a wonderful experience to spend hours and hours on the phone, just sort of talking to different people and trying to find great storytellers. But typically after I've pre-interviewed someone, I called them to see if they would be a good guest on my podcast. I'll actually develop a list of questions that I want to ask them during the actual interview. And I think of that not as a script, but as sort of a roadmap to the conversation. So I want to give you an example of an interview that I prepped for. This is an episode that is coming out soon on Feeling My Flo, the menstruation podcast. And this was like a couple of years ago that I recorded this, but it required me getting up really early, renting a car, and driving up to Albany from New York City, and basically spending the whole day with this family, 2 dads and 2 daughters, who have this really cute story about sort of how they all learned about menstruation at the same time. So Mark and Eric are these 2 dads that really didn't know much about periods, and they ended up having 2 daughters. And so it kind of became this amazing journey for all of them. So I just wanted to show you like an example of a prep sheet that I always make before every interview that I do. So it may not look like this depending on what your show is like, but I'll basically write out all the information, the logistical information at the top. And then this down here at the bottom is just like for me to know, sort of going into the interview, like, what is this really a story about? So I like to kind of have that written out for myself. So I wrote down, this is a story about a family whose love trumps uncomfortable conversations. This is a story about change. So, you know, having done a pre-interview with the dads and the daughters before I talked to them pretty extensively on the phone, I had a sense going in sort of what I wanted to get out of this conversation. Okay, and so this is also what I had on the prep sheet a little farther down. And by the way, I don't share these prep sheets with my interview subjects. I just use these for myself to sort of make sure that I am ticking off all the things I want to in the interview. But essentially, in every interview, this is kind of basic, but surprisingly easy to forget sometimes, but just having them introduce themselves in a full sentence with their name, their age, their pronouns. You can say their location, the date, their relationship to one another. These are all just really useful things to ask every single person that you interview. And then the way I structured this day was I had the 2 dads actually sit down for a conversation. And then I had the girls sit down for a conversation. So for the dads part of it, I basically just drafted out all the questions that I wanted to ask them. And these are based on the pre-interview. So like, these are the questions that I would write down after I get off the phone with them from the pre-interview. So, you know, for example, this second question, how did you feel when you found out you were having girls? I knew from the pre-interview that they had told me that they were looking forward to having boys because they didn't quite know how to deal with girls and that whole conversation of development and puberty and all that stuff. So I've basically mapped out all the questions that I have here. And we're going to talk a little bit more about questions, but I wanted to kind of show you what I tend to prepare. And then for the girls, it's a little bit shorter, but these are all questions that pertain to actual stories that the girls told me over the phone in that initial call. So I know that their school had like a puberty 101 talk, and it was a really funny story that they told me over the phone where, you know, all the parents were in the room and their dads were the only dads in the room. Everybody else had a mom there. So sort of like this awkward moment that I wanted to hear them explain that. And I also wanted the dads to tell the same story. So I included it in both of these prep sheets. So I wanted to play you an example of what I think is a good interview. And I'm gonna play you two different examples and sort of talk about why I think they're good. So the first one is this story. Can everybody hear? You just nod. Oh, you can't, okay. Now?
Can you hear me, Mia?
Yeah.
You know, you have to make sure you tell Zoom that you want to play audio before you share the screen.
Oh, okay.
Try
do you
that
know
again.
How I do that?
You can unshare, and then when you are about to select the thing that you want to share from your desktop, it's going to ask you share audio, and you click on that.
Thank you so much. Okay,
Sure.
I see. Share computer sound.
There you go.
Oh, and now it's telling me that I need. Okay, I think that should work. Was that? Okay, let me see. This totally pertains to the challenges of remote recording, so I'm glad that this is happening right now. Oops. Okay. How about now? All right, sweet. Yep. Is it too loud?
What was it like for you to come here to the US?
I didn't know besides good morning and what's your name when I came here. And when you were a baby, I used to read to you that Dr. Seuss books, like one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish. And that's how I learned English, reading to you.
You know, I never really put in much thought that you were an immigrant. I just thought that, you know, you're my mom. And I never thought that you would have to leave. I was at school when my phone buzzed and I just saw the notification that TPS was going to terminate. And I remember I started crying.
When you call me, I try to calm you down. I am like, okay, this is happening. This is really happening. So I put myself together because I knew that I have to be strong for you. And I didn't promise something that I cannot keep. So I didn't promise you that everything will be okay, but I promise I'm going to make sure that you are okay.
What are you most afraid of?
I terrified of missing you growing up. It's terrifying. I think that I'm more afraid of that than to go back to my country. Yeah.
I'm scared that I'm gonna have to do everything by myself.
You're not going to be alone, I promise to you that. And I'm very hard to get rid of. So I'm going to be on the phone all the time.
What are your hopes for the future?
that I'm going to die of an old age and be the pain on your neck all the time. And make sure that you find strength even in a bad moment.
Okay, so I wanted to play you guys that example. That was Maria Rivas and her daughter Emily, a conversation between a mother and her 15-year-old daughter. And essentially, as you kind of saw, I don't know if you might have missed at the beginning, Maria immigrated from El Salvador to the United States 2 decades ago, and she received temporary protected status, allowing her to stay and work legally. But TPS, under the Trump administration, was set to expire for nearly 200,000 immigrants. So she was basically operating under the assumption that she knew she was going to have to leave her daughter, and she didn't want to take Emily back to El Salvador. She wanted Emily, who's a U.S. citizen, to continue living here. So it was a very high-stakes conversation, and the reason I'm sharing this is just because I think sometimes a good interview is simply the stakes of the conversation. So, they weren't necessarily the most detailed storytellers, but because of the nature of this conversation, it was extremely emotionally charged, and it was this conversation that they had been talking around for a long time, but they hadn't really sat down to talk to each other about it. So I just remember that interview really sticks out to me because actually being there in their home with them and recording this interview, it was just sort of one of those moments that was like, this is a situation that's unfolding. We don't know how it's going to turn out. The stakes are very high. And because of that, it ended up being a really amazing interview. So I guess because of Mother's Day, I have another mom example to play for you, but this is from a Feeling My Flo episode. This is our host, Camila, and her mom, Shireen, and I'm gonna play you a short clip from their interview.
And then I started going to the GYN, and the GYN was telling me, don't douche.
By the way, GYN is short for gynecologist, a doctor who specializes in caring for the childbearing reproductive organs.
I was like, don't douche? I've been doing this for years.
How many years between when you got your period and when you first went to the GYN and stopped douching?
I probably was 18 when I went to the GYN.
So, 4 or 5 years you were douching?
Yeah, I was douching for that long because my mom told me
that
that
word
it was,
really gets me.
oh, is it douching or douching or what is it?
Douche.
Well, you douche, but you're douching, right? Aren't you douching when you douche?
You're saying douche.
Are you douching? Anyway, go ahead.
Okay, first of all, I just wanted to obviously play a clip about douching during this presentation, but the reason I love this interview is just because of the relationship dynamic. It's just, from the minute this mother and daughter sat down, it was just like magic and joking and poking fun at each other, and it was this amazing dynamic that really could have only happened from these two people sitting down with one another. So I know for a lot of you guys that are making podcasts, you might be the people that are interviewing others, but I think it's always worth it to think about what kind of dynamic you can create to get a great interview. And sometimes that means, people sitting down with people that they know really well, which is really what I did a lot at StoryCorps and what I'm trying to bring to Feeling My Flo, to have these kinds of conversations. I don't know if Camila and I had sat down, the host and I had sat down, we would have been able to have a conversation like this where we talk about douching like that. But it just really made me giggle, and I think it's another great example of a good interview. So I want to play you a couple of examples of bad interviewers, and I think it just really helps to hear about instances where the interview isn't so effective. So this is a daughter interviewing her mother. I guess I only have these examples, but she's interviewing her mother about when she decided to ride horses.
So that's another thing that was really interesting to me too. When was the first time that you decided that you wanted to ride horses?
Oh, I was about 5 years old, as a matter of fact, I can remember. And it was Jubilee Days. And
what is Jubilee Days?
Jubilee Days is a celebration, and they have a rodeo, and
It's a statehood celebration, correct?
I do believe, I don't know. I think it's the anniversary of Laramie.
Okay, so sort of what's good and bad about the way this person is asking questions. She starts off really well. She's asking an open-ended question, and her mom starts telling her a story, but you can kind of hear pretty quickly on that she starts asking clarification questions and she's kind of like interrupting her mom a bit. And you can even hear by the end of that clip, right, that the mom's tone of voice has kind of changed at that point. And she's a bit, maybe not as vibrant as she was at the beginning. So we're gonna listen to a little bit more and it's gonna get worse. So brace yourselves.
But I'm going to move you ahead because I think this is extremely important to my family and to future family, is that you decided right at age 5 how important it was for you to be a rodeo queen.
Yeah.
And you've told me over and over again how you decided that the best way to do that was to ride and be as Western as you could be and get every experience that you could doing that.
Right.
So I've grown up with a rich oral history of hearing how you worked at the stockyards as a young woman when women didn't do that. And you were a girl. You've told me many things, and I'd like you to touch upon that. You've told me about working at the Higbees, how you wintered your horse there, but how the ranchers took you in and you actually wrestled cows, you herded cattle, you did cattle drives, you were a ranch hand, and I'd like you to talk about those things.
Well, I did whatever I could, and everybody seemed awfully nice to me. Maybe it was because I was little and eager, you know.
You told me about riding on a cattle drive to Vitavue, and that was your first cattle drive.
Mm-hmm.
So could you tell me a little bit about those 2 days and how exhausted you were and how long you drove and the cattle on horseback?
That cattle drive was with the Bar X, and we herded cattle from down by where the ranch is. We herded cattle from there to Ames Monument, then across the highway.
Okay, so kind of what kills me when I'm listening to that is just that the daughter is like explaining everything. She's not letting the mom talk, right? And I think it comes from a place, like I want to be understanding. I think it comes from a place of wanting to know all the stories and to get them out and to have her mom's story be preserved. But every time she says something, the mom can't even get a word in edgewise. So I think another thing, you know, to think about is like how many questions or how many things she's asking her. She basically said like 20 different things, right? And you can sort of hear the emotion again of the mom sort of shutting down a little bit as that's happening. So some alternate questions the daughter could have asked, right? How did you become a rodeo queen? That's it. Super simple. Just let the mom tell her stories. What was it like working at the stockyards? Super simple. Stop talking. Let the mom answer. Question words like why, how.
What kind of investment you want to make. And it's even more difficult right now, but that's the whole point of all the analysis we do is, you know, when things are uncertain, what do you do?
I don't know what that was, but it's keeping this lively. So anyway, moving on from that, I'm going to play you one more example. And this is an example of an interviewer who's really probing for detail. And what I mean by this is that most people don't tend to speak with specificity. Most people speak in generalities. And as a producer, as a podcast producer, it's your job to draw out the detail of the story. Radio is like a super visual medium, which sometimes when you say that, that doesn't really make sense, but it is really visual because you can't see things and you need people to be able to paint a picture for you. So let's listen to this example of this, this mom and son who are remembering their late grandfather. So they're getting close to the end of the interview, and then the interviewer actually jumps in and asks them some follow-up questions. So let's listen in.
This is to a long life. I love you, Mommy.
Love you too.
And I'm happy we went and did this. And
Me too.
Hopefully we get to live long enough to watch our great grandkids listen to it.
We will.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
If you don't mind? Because we've got 5 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
I was wondering if you guys, when you're talking, you don't know this, but unconsciously you imitate your granddad and give a sense of him. I was wondering if you could sort of, even if he's not here, paint a portrait of him. So if someone heard this.
Oh, like a physical portrait?
Yeah, physically.
Okay.
Personality, things he says, what he does, you both could.
Okay, I'll do it really quickly.
Okay.
He's, I don't know, about 5'10".
5'10" is correct.
He's broad-shouldered.
Yep.
He kept all his hair.
Yep.
He doesn't. No one believes he's 90.
Correct.
Everybody thinks he's like in his 70s or younger. He's still sharp as a tack. He can remember
Two
things.
tacks.
Yep. He's full of quotes, and anecdotes, as he says it.
Millions of them.
He's done everything. He said it from a garbage man to a boxer to a radio announcer. He's been to college. You want to add anything to that?
Let's see.
Handyman.
He's better than a handyman. He's what do they call it? When
Contractor.
He's
a jack of all trades.
Jack of all trades, master of all of them.
That's true. And if you want to make friends with Charles Hudson, bring him one of his closest, oldest friends, Jack Daniels.
Which you can't have.
Yeah, which you can't have anymore because he's 90 and not feeling too well. But if you want to make friends with him, he loves to sit around and drink with his buddies.
4 days.
He's a classic, I'd say, 1920s male.
Yep.
What are those anecdotes he says? What are the things?
One of the things he says
notes,
is...
quotes, and anecdotes.
Notes, quotes, and anecdotes. One of the ones he said, if you want to make footprints in the sands of time, you better wear work boots.
Shoot. You sure
That's
better.
one of his famous
that's
lines.
one of his famous. I'm trying to think of another one.
He's got newspapers all over his walls of famous quotes and things that he likes.
Yep.
So he's, like I said, he's a very colorful individual, and hopefully he
very disciplined.
Takes some of the color with him to the man upstairs, or to his, he calls him my compadre down low. He said he was putting the icy hot on his shoulder. He says, I'm getting ready for hell. I know it's going to be warm down there. So that's about it, I'd say, about Grandpa. I'm going to miss him when he's gone.
Oh, I will. I know I will.
If he was here right now, would you say anything right now to him?
I'd say, I love you, Grandpa, and warts and all. And and I'd say, Grandpa, I know how you feel about the house. I know how you feel about all this stuff, but just let it go. So that's what I'd probably say to him. Like I said, well, I wish he could have made it, but he can't.
So I think what I love about that interview and the way that the interviewer is jumping in is that she's super observant. So when she starts seeing that there's sparks, she asks a follow-up question about it, and she gets to the specificity. So, asking for examples of the notes, quotes, and anecdotes is super important. And I think just listening to this, it's kind of an example of how folks are really open to questions. So if this is something new for you, interviewing, asking questions will show people that you're listening and that you care about their narrative. So I think she does it in a really respectful way. Okay, so I wanted to kind of summarize some of the things we've been talking about. This is what I think makes a really good interviewer: somebody who's observant, who practices active listening, even over Zoom, somebody who's unobtrusive, has a sense of empathy, asks follow-up questions, asks open-ended questions, doesn't ask 3 questions in a row. Advantage of the third ear, what I mean by that is that in the example that we just listened to, the interviewer is jumping in to 2 people who are having a conversation that know each other really well, and they know their grandfather really well. So she's the one on the outside who can think of the questions that maybe they wouldn't. She can think of the stories that maybe they're not thinking of, and she's drawing all those things out. Revealing a bit about yourself. Sometimes people don't like to do this in interviewing, but sometimes it does actually get folks to open up a little bit more. I know, I feel like Ira Glass has talked about that, and just revealing a little something about yourself will sometimes make people open up to you. And then willingness to go down random paths. The magic of the sound check. So if you are doing remote interviews right now, this is really important to be capturing some of the technical difficulties, because that can make for really interesting tape. So I've been listening to the Daily, and when they're having technical snafus and stuff, it's really interesting as the listener to hear what they're actually going through. And the sound check thing is really important, because a lot of times when you turn off the recorder, that's when people say something interesting. So, I think it's often really helpful to just keep going. And you might get some gems actually after you've been formally interviewing somebody. Okay, so I want to make sure I'm leaving enough time for questions. So I'm going to kind of go through these next slides quickly. So these are just some back pocket questions that I like to ask people. They're very simple, but elicit really detailed responses. And the next slide has them too. The way that these are divided up is sort of by fact and feeling. So, you know, asking people what happened next is a fact-based question. They'll tell you, they'll actually be able to describe a scene of something that happened to them. But then asking how did it make you feel will get them to reflect emotionally. And I think in a good story, in a radio story, in a podcast episode, it's important to have both of those things in a good interview. So these are just some back pocket questions that I tend to use a lot. Just a quick note on this. During the interview, the way I think about it is that we're professional editors as podcasters, and we're already cutting the interview as we're doing it. So it takes a lot of practice to get there, but if somebody says an amazing line, like I'm already putting it in the podcast episode and I'm like tucking it away. So during the interview, you know, make sure that you've got all the technical things down so that you can be thinking to yourself, how would I retell this story to somebody who's like not in the interview? You know, if I call my mom later and tell her, oh my God, I did such an amazing interview, what's the information that I want to get out of it? So that can help you get the information that you need in the interview. What are the different parts that I need to order the story? So maybe somebody tells you the beginning and the middle of a story, but they don't tell you the end of it. That was actually a mistake that I made a lot when I was at StoryCorps, like the first 2 years. I would always be interviewing people and then we'd like run out of time and I would never get the ending to a story. And it drove me absolutely crazy and also drove my editors crazy. So at a certain point, I started setting aside like 20 minutes to like spend on getting an ending. And some of this, you know, has to do with the fact that it was non-narrated audio that I was working with, but I think it's still a principle that can really apply to any interview. Okay, action versus reflection. This is basically, I think, another way of thinking about fact-based versus feeling-based. I'm gonna make a huge generalization about humankind, which is that half of people are good at recounting the facts and half of people are good at reflecting on their feelings. And it's very rare to find a person who's good at both of those things. So when I was at StoryCorps and with the work that I'm doing now, I often will find out pretty early on during an interview, I'll be like, oh, this person is super detailed and they know how to paint a scene. So they're like taking me back to this memory in their life or whatever, but they don't know how to reflect on it emotionally. So I need to keep probing at them and ask them those types of questions versus a person who's like really in touch with their emotions and is really good at talking about what impact that made on them, but isn't super good at painting a scene. So I have to ask questions that are like, hey, take me back to that moment. Like what was actually happening around you? Like what were the smells? What were the, you know, what were the sounds? Paint a picture for me. You know, I wasn't there. So I think Bojack would probably be a reflector if I had to guess. Okay, so I'm not spending a ton of time on this, but we can totally talk about this more. In the past month and a half, as I'm sure a lot of you have been doing, I've been figuring out how to do everything remotely, and it's been super challenging because I'm a huge control freak, and I like to be up in the person's house with a microphone in front of their face. I want to know exactly what the acoustics are in that person's house. I want to like unplug their refrigerator. I want to take down their wind chimes. I want to like put their pets and children into another room. And so the new reality that we live in right now is like super hard, right? Because we need to let go of all of the control that we normally have. So I'll tell you what I've been doing lately. I've been using this program called Squadcast. I know Zencastr and CleanFeed are also similar to those platforms, but essentially what it is it's a video conferencing program, much like Zoom. And what I've been doing is I've been actually training people on how to record themselves with their own phone using the voice memo app. And simultaneously, I've been recording with them on Squadcast. And the reason for that is because I want a primary source of audio that is like decent quality, and I also want a backup option. So in case this goes wrong, I have this as a backup option. So the Squadcast recording, you know, the quality is not great because it's really depends on what kind of microphone the person's computer has, but I have actually found that voice memo audio is like better quality than you would think. Not to the point where all of these podcasters are like, I've been spending fortunes on tape syncers and studios. Like, I'm not going that far, but I'm just saying it's better than I thought it was. And I think the most important thing about COVID era recording is that you have to be really willing to train your interview subjects. So I've done a lot of walkthroughs with people to find the quietest room in their house. And I've had them actually show me your entire basement. I've been doing a lot of training just as far as helping them locate a carpeted room, you know, a room that's maybe away from the street, away from humming refrigerators, away from noisy children. All of these things will, I put humming refrigerators in there twice because that's how much I hate them. But basically the point of this is to say that like the more work you do on the front end to try to get a good quality recording, the easier it's going to be for you, you know, when you're editing and in post. Like, and having done like hundreds of recordings in many different types of spaces, and then brought a lot of that back to the office and gotten into it in the office. I mean, I've wanted to kill myself so many times for like not taking that extra step right in the place when I'm actually recording to ensure that the quality is decent, because it just makes it so much easier. So the lessons are, everyone's an audio expert now. I saw, you know, I listened to the Daily recently and they had Dr. Fauci on there and he was probably recording himself on his own phone and he sounded really good. I was really impressed. And then the other point is I recommend 2 recording platforms, a principal and a backup. So that's all I have for you guys. I'd love to open this up to a discussion if you have questions.
Thank you, Mia. Group Zoom applause. I don't even know what that is. Wave your hands in the air. Thank you, Mia. Yeah, look at techie people putting little applauses out there. Yeah, so feel free. I think we have a small enough group that you can unmute yourself. If you have a question, if it gets a little crazy, then I can help moderate. But yeah, if you have a question, go ahead and jump on in.
I do. I tried a test today with Zencaster with a colleague of mine because I have to do a podcast tomorrow afternoon with no preparation because I got that information today. I work for an association. We're dealing with a state budget crisis. And when I did the test, my colleague wasn't healthy in her mic, and I'm not sure how to deal with that. So I've scheduled Clean Feed, which seems better because we're in a budget crisis, because we're a state association dealing with education. The squad one, I'm sorry, it's just been a crazy day. The squad one or whatever it is. They require you get 7 days free and then it's, you know, a monthly charge. So I'm trying to go as free as I can. What are your recommendations?
Well, we're using Squadcast, and I think for the Period podcast, we share it with a couple different shows. So we're paying like for like 9 hour or like, I think it's something like 12 hours a month or something, or it's probably more than that. But I think it really depends on your needs, right? Like, are you going to be doing interviews like every day? Are you going to be doing hour-long interviews?
No, just I have a podcast tomorrow. We've been doing webinars. We deal with school boards that are in crisis mode right now. So we're doing a podcast on a funding situation to help with education as dealing with the crisis we're in. So a podcast can get out much quicker than me editing a webinar afterwards for those that don't attend the webinar.
Yeah, I just saw that Mike said that Squadcast has an hourly rate now. So, and I will say that we tried using Clean Feed, or like I share Squadcast with like a couple other shows. Some of the other producers used Clean Feed and they said that Squadcast was just more straightforward. So it's been working well for me. I haven't had any technical difficulties, but I've also been, all of my guests have been pretty tech savvy, except for one person whose 12-year-old son had to basically engineer the entire interview. And I was like, yes. So yeah, if there's children around, I would usually be banishing them to another room, but like they know what they're doing. They know how to use voice memo and stuff. So actually, children are quite useful.
Well, thank you.
Hey, I wanted to offer up some information. I started out as a voiceover and I did some traveling overseas and I had a gig. And I found that using the inside of a small car is a really good recording studio.
I assume the car's not driving. It's just stationary.
Yeah, and you got to drive it. I mean, I drove it into an orchard. So I drove it way off the road so nobody could hear what's going on.
Orchards are quiet. I like that.
Except for birds. If you have birds, that will punch through for sure. But you just take it to a quiet end of a road or something, and it was a great recording studio.
You heard it here, folks. Drive your car to an orchard. I love it. I love it.
I also had to have somebody switch a room recently because of birds. And one time I had a recording in Colorado that was on a mountain, and it was the most idyllic place I've ever been. There was like birds and like pine trees, and it was like just beautiful. And these birds kept interrupting the recording. And so I went outside and threw pine cones at them until they flew away, which I admit is like really intense, but it was a really important interview. And my co-producer was there with me and has never not given me crap for it. So you got to do what you got to do.
Are you not training your interview subjects to throw pine cones at birds whenever necessary?
Well, I think that's something we're gonna have to teach them to do. At the time, they were really like bemused by me. So,
Hey, Mia, I have a question.
Right.
I'm wondering how you, or if you have done any kind of like remote, I guess, audio journals with subjects where folks record themselves, not necessarily replying to specific questions of yours, but with some general guidance about ideas to riff off of. And do you have any tips on that, on how to do that well?
That's a great question. I actually did ask a family to start recording themselves. And I haven't reviewed the tape yet. I don't know what it's gonna be like because this is a family with 3 children. So there's 2 parents and 3 children, and they're all in a one bedroom cabin during the quarantine.
Oh, wow.
So I'm like, there's probably not a single quiet moment in that cabin, but I'm also hopeful that that will be like charming. But I guess I'm assuming that you're asking them to record like on their phones, right?
Yeah, but I mean, in my experience, I found that people really, they're intimidated even by their phones, and they go into like scripted mode and start drafting things and literally reading a script. And it's been hard for me to communicate, like, no, really, I just want you to like document your feelings and your thoughts on this thing, never mind the technical side and being in a quiet room. That's even harder, but I'm curious about. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer it, but I mean, I would maybe share with them some of those like teenage radio diaries or something, like as an example, or something like that to just get them to hear like exactly what you're asking for. And then again, like maybe, I don't know if they're with other people that hopefully people they like and love during the quarantine, but you could ask them to interview each other or something like that. Because if they're with someone that they feel comfortable with, they might open up a little bit more.
Right. That allows them to kind of like just act natural and respond to another human being. Mm-hmm.
Cool. It might, yeah. Let me know how it goes. I'm curious to know the answer to that.
Yeah, me too. Thanks.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Ashley.
Thanks. So I guess my question would be based around what do you do in an interview when, the conversation kind of goes off the rails kind of in a negative way and you want to get it back together, or it gets like really uncomfortable and you want to, you know, like, all right, we're going to leave that alone and like move forward type of thing?
Uncomfortable, like in what way? Like the person is getting upset, or like, are they talking about
getting upset, or just, yeah, I would say like getting upset.
When I was at StoryCorps, I did a lot of stories about really traumatic things. So folks were talking about really difficult subjects. I interviewed like, you know, folks that had lost family members in school shootings and things like that. And it was very intense. So what I always tell people before the interview even starts is, if you don't want to answer one of my questions, you don't have to. I know that's maybe not what every like journalist would do, but if you're asking someone to give their time to you, I think it's important to give them that out. And usually at that point, you've hopefully built enough trust with them that they will trust you with their story and they will open up. And then my other recommendation is just like, don't say anything if they're getting upset. I mean, if they're breaking down and crying, sometimes the best thing you can do is just like allow that to have space. And a lot of times we'll want to jump in and like say something. But I've heard a lot of instances in interviews where the interviewer just like lets that person breathe and like cry a little bit. And it can often make the interview experience better for that person, to just let them, you know, have that opportunity to experience an emotion and like move through it. I know that's not like a natural thing to do in our culture. We want to just like fill up the space so much. And then in terms of getting upset, I don't know if anyone's ever gotten upset, like angry.
Has there been any like arguments and it's like, okay, let's refocus type of thing?
I definitely feel like at StoryCorps, I just saw all kinds of human relationships at play, and there was like like tension and like just different family dynamics. But I mean, they're there because they want to be there. So most of the time it's just about letting them be and like giving them that space. But if you do feel like it's maybe at a point where you're super uncomfortable and want to move on, and you're like, this isn't going to work for my podcast, you can definitely always pretend that there's a technical difficulty. That's like a good out. Like, oh, there's a problem with the recorder. If it's too uncomfortable, you can just make that up. If you're maybe not feeling safe or something like that.
Thank you.
So dynamic probably helps a lot with stuff like that. And dynamic is probably established before your interview. So if you're meeting someone for the first time in a pre-interview, what are the most important things to ask to kind of build that dynamic?
Yeah, I think it depends on the story, but if it's a really tough topic, I'll basically approach it pretty gingerly and just ask them fact-based questions. So like, you know, I guess when the example I played you with the mom and daughter who are going through the TPS thing, they had spoken about it publicly a little bit, but, you know, I'd start with kind of softball questions in the pre-interview. So like, tell me about what it was like for you growing up. I asked the daughter, what's your relationship like with your mom, and like that type of thing, to just sort of get like general information. And I think you can kind of suss out from that how comfortable they are, you know, tackling more difficult parts of it. But I also think there's really a balance in the pre-interview. You really don't want the person to be telling you all their stories in the pre-interview, because sometimes then you'll get to the actual interview and they'll be like, I already told you that. Or they won't want to hash out the entire thing again because it's like a really tough topic. So sometimes the best case scenario is like when you have a great storyteller and they tell you like 2 amazing stories in the pre-interview, and then you're like, and you're like, this is amazing, love it, let's save it for the interview. I want to hear all this in the interview. And you know, just because they're such a detail-rich storyteller, that they're going to be able to give you more stories. That's like a dream scenario.
So with a podcast that maybe has a theme, or talk about your Flow podcast, I'm assuming a lot of interviews can be very similar. Is the expectation, do you come in with like pre-set questions where like, these are the questions I'm going to ask, you take those into like a pre-interview and then find their story? Sorry, my son's playing, talking about children. Or do you have this, do you just kind of go into it open, have the pre-interview, kind of build the story that you think that's going to be told, and then move from there?
You can have your kid help you out with your next interview, by the way.
Yes.
I mentioned that already. I can tell that your kid will be helpful.
He's a talker, so he knows what he's doing at least.
I would say, yeah, I mean, I always, before a pre-interview, I don't usually have anything written down, but I have a sense of who this person is, like what they do, and it's kind of basic at that point. But it also depends sort of on who the person is. Like right now I'm trying to find an astronaut. I've not been super successful. They don't want to talk to me right now, I guess. But astronauts maybe don't have that much time. Like that's just a high profile person. So I might do less pre-interviewing in that case and save a lot of it for the actual interview, knowing that stories about space are just going to be inherently interesting. So I'm not that worried about the pre-interview. But I would say it's during the pre-interview that I'm taking notes. So I actually would not pre-interview people over Zoom because you don't want them to see you being like this during the entire call. I would call them, and like knowing how to work the phones and have long phone conversations is such a lost art, but it's like so important for this work. So I'll just get on the phone and then I'll literally just be taking notes. And if they tell me an interesting story, I'll write it down. If they have an interesting turn of phrase, I'll like write it down. Anything that's distinctive about them. And then as soon as I get off the phone from the pre-interview, that's when I write down all of the things that I know I want to actually get in the actual interview. I know you guys may not have the time to be doing it at this level, and you may be just going straight into interviews, but if you do have time, at least, I would say if you don't have time for a pre-interview, I would maybe make some kind of prep sheet like the one that I showed you, where I just have like a bunch of questions that I'm going to try to draw out, and hopefully get detail-rich stories.
I have another question about pre-interviews. So you're saying with like, how much time do you dedicate to a pre-interview? Because I feel like that, again, you don't want to get too far into the stories, but you want to get a good sense of their way of speaking and what sort of all that. Can you speak to that a little bit more? Because I know you said it might be a long phone call, and I was like, how long is long? So
that's a great question, and I don't have a set time actually for pre-interviews. You know, once I get a sense of three things, which is, you know, are they a good talker? What is the story? Like, what are the details in the story? And just getting them on the phone with me so that they can begin to build trust with me is also really important. So it really depends. Like you know, if I'm calling, you know, if I'm calling someone who's gotten a lot of media exposure, then they're generally like not as suspicious of me calling them. You might have to do more work with someone who's really not used to being interviewed and to just answer any questions that they might have about what your podcast is or something like that. But I feel like, again, a pre-interview is like an audition, which is a weird thing to say, but I really think it's true. Like when I've found really amazing storytellers, like I've stayed on the phone with them for like an hour and a half, 2 hours, because they're just such amazing talkers. I want to hear from them. So that's what I would say. And then just knowing when to kind of cut it off though too, and getting off the phone with them so that they don't tell you all the stories in the pre-interview is also really important.
Gotcha. Just a little thing. I'm a bit of a word nerd, so audition totally makes sense because it literally means like hearing, like the hearing of someone. So like as far as a pre-interview, likening it to an audition. So.
Wait, sorry, you just broke up a little bit. I couldn't hear you.
No.
Can you say that one more time?
I'm a bit of a word nerd, so like audition makes complete sense with the pre-interview because it literally means like listening. So, yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes like as much pre-interviewing as you do, like maybe they still won't really want to tell you things until you get to the interview. I remember I was calling like these like 90 something year old men in Texas because I was trying to do a story about the Great Drought of 1954, which basically made all of West Texas into like a desert, and ranchers were really struggling at that time. And I found these brothers that were like in their 90s, and they like wouldn't really say anything to me over the phone. And I was just like, well, I guess I'm just gonna have to like show up and interview them. And for various reasons that didn't end up working out, but honestly, they had like such amazing accents and stuff, and just like the way they talked, I was like, I know this is going to be good. So I wasn't super worried about them not being able to tell the stories.
I'll ask a question. I read an interesting article recently about the challenge of Zoom for our relationships in terms of like you really can't make eye contact, which for humans is so much about building trust. And Zoom, like we kind of look at ourselves and look at each other and we're all looking up and to the side kind of on some level. So do you have any tips for how we can build trust with folks in a virtual world?
Oh, that's so hard. Yeah, and I also feel like being in the physical space with someone when they're talking about something really difficult is like really important. I think that's really hard. I don't know the answer to that. I would say just being transparent with your interview subjects will help, because like, you know, most people that don't have experience with podcasting or radio like don't really know how this normally goes. So if you're interviewing them with Zencaster, you can give like a little preamble and be like, hey, like, I know this is kind of weird. Normally I'd like be in your house and we could be sitting down together and be comfortable and really take the time and space to be together and have you tell the story. But just bear with me on this. But yeah, I think I don't know how we're going to get around that. Because I also know that like really amazing audio storytellers will spend like hours with people in person and just be like recording the entire time. So, and yeah, we're all kind of zoomed out, right? So I don't know, maybe yeah, it's real. Maybe think about like interviewing them at certain times of the day before they're zoomed out. And if you know it's going to be a really difficult conversation or it's a really serious topic or something, yeah, just giving them like the space and the choice of moving on and like not answering a question. I don't know, I always practice that, and I've found that most people will answer the question, but simply being asked, like being told it's okay to not answer this question will like help them foster more trust with you.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Since we all are zoomed out, I really appreciate you guys spending this hour with me. And I'm like, oh, somebody asked about the United Space Fund. I actually went right through NASA, which maybe was not the best way to go about it, but well, it's about menstruation. I guess astronauts just don't want to talk about menstruation. They want to talk about outer space. I'm like, I don't care about outer space. Tell me about the menstruation. But yeah, if you guys have any more questions though, feel free to reach out to me. I can just write my email in the thing.
Yeah. Folks, feel free to drop your email addresses in the chat. I'll grab all of them if you haven't sent me yours yet. I know I have some of yours from past time, so I wrote down a list of everyone who's here, but I'll make sure you get the recording so you can go back to different slides and make sure you have what you need to really soak up the good information.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Mia. We really appreciate having you here. And that is one of the gifts of virtual classrooms is here you are.
It's true.
And here we are, all in different places. So thank you everyone for being here. It's so good seeing your faces. Like I mentioned, on the 26th, we're doing a storytelling event with William. And so you guys can join us the 26th. It's right on Eventbrite and Facebook, where you can find all of our House of Pod events. So you guys have a great night. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
It's great to see you
Bye.
all. Take care. Hang in
You.
there.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye.